Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Wherever you are, we're just thrilled to have people all around the world joining us today to talk about the complexities of returning to work, which we now face. So today in this webinar, we will tackle some of the most pressing issues for organizations and business leaders as we start to transition from work from home to a gradual return to the workplace. The core oriented topic is how we can help employees navigate this new normal by better assessing and managing their risk perceptions and truly understanding what they need, what they really need. So that's what we're going to focus on. How can we help employees as they navigate this next normal with all of its intricacies and complexities with working from home and returning to work. But before we go any further, I'll introduce the hosts, and I'll start with myself. So I'm Juan Salcedo. I'm an associate at BE Works, and I'm also the practice and growth lead for Latin America. I'm based in Bogota, Colombia. I do have a PhD in social psychology, and the overarching theme of my research has been signaling. More specifically, how and what we communicate to each other via our actions. So I've done research all the way from investor signaling market bubbles to how signal trust improves or deteriorates after punishments. At BE Works, I've worked with companies in telecommunications, transportation, and finance sectors. Up next, we have Kelly Peters. Kelly is the co-founder of BE Works, the world's first management consulting firm dedicated to solving complex challenges with behavioral economics. Kelly is responsible for the creation and propagation of the BE Works method, which is now applied at Global 1000 firms to drive innovation. In addition to her business expertise, Kelly is also a faculty lecturer of applied behavioral science at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto, and she's a regular speaker at universities like Cornell and Harvard. And she frequently writes for top business and scientific publications and has led hundreds of projects around the world in all kinds of sectors. In sum, she's one of the world's leading behavioral science practitioners and advocates. And the final introduction to make before we get going is Dan Ariely. Dan is the co-founder of BE Works and professor of behavioral economics at Duke University. Dan's truly groundbreaking research and writing has made him one of the most well-known leaders in the field of behavioral economics. Dan's prolific writing and irrational decision-making has been featured not only in top academic journals, but also in several popular media outlets, such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. And he has 3 New York Times best-selling books that have become really recognized standards in the field. And he's a sought-after speaker at major events around the globe. So with the introductions out of the way, I'd like to point you to a common picture that we are starting to see all around the world, from Latin America to North America, from Europe to Asia. And this is how societies are starting to gradually ease lockdown measures, and organizations which had the vast majority of their workforce at some point working from home are starting to ask themselves, how do we make the transition to a gradual return to work? What does that look like? And so the key aspect of today's webinar is really how behavioral economics and specifically and behavioral science in general can help us to identify and overcome the barriers of that return to work. How can we do that better? So with that, I'll hand it over to Kelly, who is going to tell us why returning to work is not as simple as back to normal.
Thanks so much, Juan. I appreciate that, and welcome everybody to this webinar. It's an exciting and complex topic. It's funny because we've all been thinking about working from home for years. This is nothing new. We've wanted things like flexible Fridays and to have that option to work from home. this was something that we want. And now the situation is upon us, and we realize that there are a lot of complexities that need to be thought through, especially from an employer perspective. And I think the statement on the next slide is that many employees have wanted this, and the issue has been studied through some really fascinating academic research. So, for instance, the area of studying telecommuting and telework has been it's almost a flourishing area within academia. And one of the studies that we found that we thought was particularly useful was this issue of sort of these silver linings of work from home. We have to recognize that employers have always been very concerned about things like our productivity, or will employees feel disconnected from one another. And yet we found that, when you actually look at empirical research, employees can do incredibly well. Their productivity can go up. This was a study that was done with 16,000 employees with one of the largest travel agencies in China. And they set this up as a proper empirical experiment. So it ran for 9 months, and they used a lottery to figure out which employees would work from home and which ones would continue to come into the office. And all of the other factors were kept constant, and that included things like the technology and so on, compensation and so on. And what they found was that overall, productivity had a very significant performance increase. The number of calls that people were making increased. There was less time spent commuting, and the number of breaks decreased. The other factors, like the amount of time that people took off over the course of the 9 months, there were fewer sick days. So overall, the productivity of employees went up. Now you might think, well, there's a trade-off, right, between your productivity going up and maybe your satisfaction, because you're working harder than ever. But it turns out that these employees reported lower levels of exhaustion, and it was in part contributed by things like not having to commute to work, but also their overall job satisfaction went up, again, in ways that we wouldn't necessarily predict having such a positive impact when we're not working with our colleagues. So this shows us that maybe employers' understandings of the impact to productivity or the impact to job satisfaction might not be as intuitively obvious as we might suspect. But if we go to the next slide, employers have had these concerns about productivity and fairness and logistics. And even though we've had some fascinating empirical research being done recently about this topic, it's remained unanswered, and employers have been shy or reluctant to proceed with work from home policies. And yet here we are. COVID-19 has forced our hand, and next slide, please. And the workforce transformation, it has to happen. We no longer have a choice in terms of enabling a hybrid workforce, and we have to either fully sustain work from home or enable a hybrid work environment. On the next slide, one of the things that's been interesting is that we actually have some early findings now. We have a couple months worth of data from different sources, including a company who we've been collaborating with on the early research on this. Even the BE Works team and other polls have all found that even though we've been working in isolation, many people want to keep this going. The numbers that we tend to see is that there's about a third that are chomping at the bit and ready to get back to work, and about 2/3 that are very comfortable with keeping this going. And that's both either continuing the full work from home or a hybrid work environment. The individuals that are keen to get back to work, they do have some additional complexities that we have to take into consideration, and that is things like childcare issues and being able to work in an at-home environment free from those distractions of children can be very stressful. And maybe those numbers would be different if there were flexible childcare options that would support people working from home. And so that is something we want to take into consideration as we move into hybrid models. But other things that we found include things like people who are introverts have said that they found that the work from home environment to be very conducive to their creativity. And so there have been these potentially unexpected benefits, the silver lining, so to speak, things that we've learned so far. Next slide, please. So that means that as employers, we're confronted with this reality of this challenge of needing to embrace and adopt a hybrid model. And many companies are starting to make their declaration of things like they're comfortable with their 100% of their workforce working from home for the rest of the year. We've got other companies already making a commitment to this new blended workplace. So this change is happening, but there's still many things that we need to learn. And this is some of the stuff that we want to share with you. So on the next slide, basically say return to work is not going to be as simple as back to normal. So it used to be that it was as much maybe about a preference of working from home or the office. It was maybe things like you had a report that you needed to get done, and so you wanted to work from home where you had that space to focus. So maybe you didn't want to commute on on a busy day, so you wanted to reduce your overall commute time. But these are aspects of just making that choice. But now, one of the things that we need to take into consideration, that a major factor for employers will be understanding people's perception of risk. So this isn't just a matter of which environment are you most productive in, but now we need to understand employees' overall perception of risk. And if you look at the next slide, we've captured some of these complex risks that people are thinking about, which is things like, will I become infected with SARS-CoV-2 while I commute? Or how about, will my colleagues comply with safety measures? So it's not necessarily about our own behavior, but the behavior of others. Or the big question, is it just simply too soon to return? When is a good time from a local and global perspective? Some other questions are around, are the employers taking adequate measures to mitigate the potential risk of infection? Or in fact, will I unknowingly affect my colleagues? And so the thing is, we're all assessing these issues very differently. We have complicated and sometimes confusing guidance that's coming from our public health leaders. The path to understanding where our science is at from an epidemiological perspective can be hard for people to understand. And so even employers don't know which guidance to go with, and employees don't know what the probabilities of these risks are. And so we're left in a situation where there's many unknowns, and the calculus to accurately determine these risks is incredibly difficult to calculate. And if we think about this issue of risk perception and its impact on shaping people's likelihood to return to work, we can look at some of the classic things in behavioral economics to really understand that risk perception is so complex. It's not just about what a true probabilistic risk is, but it's how we even interpret the question and how that question is framed to us. So in this classic study, the choice or the scenario that's in blue is actually very similar to the scenario that's in orange on the right. And if you were presented with these two programs, again, in this classic study, which one, on the left, which one would you choose? 200 people being saved by this, potential cure, or would you choose a scenario where a third could probably be saved and 2/3 probably won't be saved? Well, in this case, this is called gain framing, and most people choose that sure bet, of that sure option A. But that same problem, just framed differently, where 400 people will die, is presented as the sure fact. And then the probabilistic approach of the potentially risky scenario is the one that people choose. Now, again, this is showing us that when we have something that's like a survival framing, people are likely to choose the sure thing. But then that same outcome, when it's presented as death framing, they choose the probabilistic approach because we want to get away from a sure loss. Now, and we can talk more about this particular study, but what I wanted to do was to just showcase that our perception of risk is very malleable and even vulnerable to something as simple as how things are presented. And so this challenge then of understanding, the drivers and barriers of bringing employees back to work is very complex. So it's not so simple as just asking people. And we've outlined 4, but there are other barriers on the next slide to being able to get a good understanding of where, understanding where our employees are at. So for instance, we're generally poor predictors of how we will feel in the future. So if we're to ask our employees today what they would want to do in the future, we might have some significant bias in there. Another barrier is optimism bias might skew our perception of the likelihood of a negative event occurring, something like ourselves or our colleagues getting sick or worse. Then another challenge that employers have with trying to do these pulse checks with employees is that employees won't necessarily follow through on what we say we're going to do. So for instance, we might say that we're going to engage in risk mitigation behaviors, but then we don't necessarily follow through on that. And then last but not least, there's this challenge of response bias. And so again, depending on how we're asked a question can influence our answer. And I wanted to share a little bit more with you on that. On the next slide, one of the things that in the audits that we've been doing on many of the return to work surveys have been presenting employees and other participants in this research with kind of these full menus of like, which of these things would you want to see back in the office? What needs to be true of these potential mitigation tactics? Which ones do you need to be there in order for you to return to the office? But it turns out that this is not a very helpful way to truly solicit people's preferences. Generally, there's a high skew to selecting all, as opposed to selecting the ones that matter the most. And so from this, on the next slide, we have a warning, basically, that if we don't ask people the right questions in the right way, we run the risk of not truly understanding what our employees need to be mobilized to come back to the workforce or to work in a hybrid work environment where they feel safe, productive, and creative. So the kinds of things that we can do would be to leverage scientific approaches to understanding real preferences. And so we've highlighted 3 approaches that are captured here. So asking employees to take the perspective of the employer is one step to helping increase their likelihood to provide an answer that is more true and more aligned to their preferences. Having employees choose from amongst a list and then rank that list will help us to uncover the nice to haves versus the essentials that will bring people back to the workplace. So it's one thing then to have a better understanding of what are the criteria that people need in terms of feeling safer to come back to work, to help understand that perception of risk. And let's say we are successful in mobilizing our workforce, well, then we face some other challenges. And so on the next slide, it's not just about getting employees to return. We've got some other challenges. So one of those would be around compliance. So we talk a little bit more about this fascinating realm of compliance and in terms of safety behavior on the next slide. It turns out that risk perceptions are very important because they're ultimately tied to the adoption of and the ongoing compliance with safety behaviors. And remember, one of the factors in this is not just my own behavior, but the behavior of my colleagues in the workplace. And so we need to recognize that how people perceive risk has a significant influence on their compliance with risk behaviors. But it turns out there was a study that was done with 500 factory workers, and despite exposure to loud noises, regardless of the type of job that they had, even previous training that they had about safety, their opinion and perception of safety in the employer workplace, the thing that had the highest prediction capability in terms of the likelihood to wear safety gear was their perception of risk. And so what this tells us is that when we want our employees to comply with risk mitigation behaviors, we want to talk to them actually about the perception of risk and the possible outcomes. So it's not mere training, but rather training that incorporates talking about the psychology of risk that is likely to increase their compliance and make it an overall safer workplace. But then again, it's still not so simple, because even if we get compliance with safe workplace protocols, safety measures can lead to greater risk taking. There's been fascinating research on things like implementing safety procedures, but then people changing the nature of the behavior that they have. For instance, seatbelts can lead to people being more likely to speed. Putting increased, tools like visors on helmets have led to hockey players taking more risk. And that behavior has been measured through things like penalty time. So there's this complicated backfiring effect that people have when it comes to implementing safety procedures. So in case we follow through with good compliance on one behavior, we have the risk of increasing our risk taking in another domain. So when it comes to work from home, on the next slide, there were 3 points that I wanted to convey to you, which is that asking our employees and asking people what they want doesn't necessarily tell you what it is that they want. That understanding the role of risk perception is crucial, and being able to help shape and guide that risk perception will lead to better outcomes. And then last but not least, we need to understand the challenges of compliance. It's not necessarily so straightforward in terms of having a healthy and safety workplace where our employees are comfortable returning.
So the plot you just saw showed lots of lines going up. And what is this based on? We took data from 800 companies. Most of them are traded in the stock market. So we'll take the one that are not traded in the stock market, not public companies. And for each of them, we have about 1,000 people who tell us how they feel about the company every year from 2006 until now. So we have 2006 until now, hundreds of companies. And the way people tell us how they feel about the company is in all kinds of ways. People answer all kinds of questions. We'll show you the slide again in a second, so you could see what it is. Okay, so think about it. About 80 questions from 2006 until today, about hundreds of companies. That was the database. And what did we do? To start with, we took one question at a time. Let's say there was one question that says, how satisfied are you with the quality of the furniture at your workplace? We took that one question. And we went back to 2006 data, and we said, imagine we sorted the data from the best companies to the worst companies on this one dimension. How much do you like the quality of the furniture? And we bought in the stock market the top 20% of companies who treat their employees best on quality of furniture. And we kept that portfolio. In 2007, we got new data. Maybe one company went up, one company went down, and we changed our portfolio. So we had a portfolio from 2006 until today that held the stocks of the 20% best company who treated their employees best on quality of coffee, on equality of pay between men and women, on how fair they feel the workplace, on management transparency, almost 80 different dimensions. So we have these almost 80 different portfolios, and now we can ask how many of them outperform the S&P 500. And what we found is that almost all of them outperform the S&P 500. Some by a little, some by a lot. And by the way, when we buy the bottom 20% of the companies, that the companies treat their employees worse, almost all of them underperform the S&P 500. By the way, that was incredibly, can we show the slide for a second again? That data, by the way, in orange, you can see the S&P 500, right? So you can see almost all portfolios do better than the S&P 500. And just to be clear, for me, this was amazing, right? Because it said, it's really easy to beat the S&P 500. All you need to do is to ask people how they treat their employees, how the employees feel about the company. But then we can say, okay, which one that beat it just by a little and which one that beat it by a lot. And interestingly, all the things that matter are the things that create real deep connection with the company. So for example, things like employee benefit don't matter so much. People who rated the environment as caring, that was really a big deal. Job titles don't matter so much. Honest mistake valued. People who worked in companies where they felt that in their company honest mistakes are valued, those were much, much better companies. Anyway, the point was that there were things that didn't matter a lot and things that did. And all the things that did basically were loading on things like autonomy, connection, reciprocity. All the things that didn't matter had to do with quality of furniture, coffee, benefit, salary. By the way, salary was interesting. Absolute level of salary didn't matter so much. Relative level of salary and fairness of salary mattered a lot. So when we take, we can drop the slide for now. When we take the 18 different dimensions that we quantified as being the most important from this set, and we said, what if we invested based on all of those 18 together? The return was almost 9% a year over the S&P 500. And for me, this was an incredible insight, right? Think about it, a strategy, an investment strategy, a simulation of a strategy that doesn't look at earnings, quarterly reports, nothing. Just looks at employees' assessment of their own companies can yield such a return over the S&P 500. Now, in some sense, it's amazing. In some sense, it's obvious. Now, why is it there? Imagine what we call the goodwill gap. Imagine the amount that people have to work not to lose their job. And then imagine how high we could get if we really care. And think about that gap. We call it the goodwill gap. And the thing is, you can contract on the minimum. I can force you to show up, for example, to work. I can't force you to be extra creative. I can get you to a meeting. I can't get you to try your hardest. So we have the minimum, and then we have what people are really excited. And by the way, the people who are excited are the people who are pushing the company forward. Because when we look at the data, we find that if you look at any kind of question with a normal distribution, it's the people who are particularly excited to push the company forward, the people who have a very high goodwill. These are the people that innovate, try, change things, right? That's where improvement comes from. Now, as Kelly was saying, COVID-19 has not changed anything structural. It just made some important things even more important. So if you think about goodwill and you say, what is important about goodwill? Goodwill is about the fact that the employee at their own discretion can decide how much effort to put in. And if we worked in some physical environment, maybe people can't control it. If I ask you to organize some tables and chairs and so on, I could say, hey, this is not so good and so on. But when we do work that is mostly between our ears, when we're in the information economy, we have more control. We as the employees have more control, and therefore it's more about our goodwill. And when people work from home, that's even more so. Now, during the Corona period, of course, people are not just working from home. They're working from home sometimes with great complexities, like kids at home, right? That's very, very tough. And because of that, how much they try, how much they care, it's so easy to do less. And goodwill is important. So all the things we showed you about honest mistakes of value, transparency, caring environment, and so on, always matter. I suspect that now they'll matter even more. Why? Goodwill matters even more. People are less supervised. There's more opportunities for changes, and therefore it will become more important. Okay, so that was the first topic. Can we go back to the slides? Okay, let's move to the next slide. Okay, so we said that motivation in general is much more important in these days. Psychological safety is one of them, and of course, all of these things bring up loyalty as well. Okay, next slide. Okay, the next topic I want to talk about is something called learned helplessness. And the experiment I want to describe to you is an experiment that will be, this will be the second step. So let's turn off the slide. The first step of the experiment was the following. You had a dog in a cage, and from time to time, there was a light. And a few seconds later, electrical shock. Light, a few seconds later, electrical shock. That's it for a few days. And the dog learned that every time a light comes up, a few seconds later, there's electrical shock. And then there was another dog in a separate cage, far away. And in that cage, that dog got the same shocks as the first dog. They were timed. It's called yoke. They were timed. But the second dog did not see the predicting part. They did not get the light. So there was light, and then both dogs got a shock, but the first dog knew it, and the second one didn't. The first dog knew that the shock was coming, the second one didn't. Now, think about it. What do you think is the difference? I don't want to say, imagine you were this dog, but imagine you lived in a world in which you got bad information, or bad information, I mean not negative information, telling you something is wrong. You got some negative shocks, you got some terrible things happening to you. One time you knew they were coming, and one time you didn't know they were coming. What's the difference? And the thing I wanted to think about is, what is the difference in terms of stress? What's the difference of resilience? What's the difference in terms of your ability to withstand those things? And the way they tested it is that they moved the dog to a second apparatus, the one we showed in the previous slide. And in this second apparatus, there was a little room with a partition in the middle and two sides. And from time to time, there was a bell. And if the dog stayed on its side, they would get an electrical shock. But if they jumped over the partition, they could escape the shock. So in this case, the sound is coming up. If the dog stays on their side, they will get shocked. If they move to the other one, they will avoid the shock. Now, what happened to the two dogs? The first dog got on their side. There was a bell. They got a shock. They tried to move around, figure out what's going on. And eventually they figure out if they jump over the partition, they avoid the shock. And from that point on, every time there was a bell, they jumped, completely avoid the shocks. The second dog didn't explore their environment. The second dog basically laid whimpering on the floor. The second dog, by the way, also had a decrease in their natural killer cells, in their one of the most important immune system, and later studies show that they were more susceptible to cancer and other things like that because their immune system was weakened. And what's the point here? The point is that we and dogs have tremendous resilience. But this resilience is aided when we know that bad things are coming. And when bad things are coming in an unpredictable way, that makes it much, much tougher to deal with. It's not just a shock, it's knowing that it's coming. Now in our world, there's a lot of bad things are happening in general, and COVID-19, of course, is making things worse. And there are bad things happening in terms of work and fear and anxiety and financial anxiety and all kinds of things like that. So now the question is, what can we do? If we understand that one of the causes is this not knowing what's coming, then we need to try and give people some sense of what things are coming. So let's say I'm going to announce a change in compensation. I'm going to reduce 10% of the salary for people. Should I just announce it, or should I lead to it over time? Let's say we give instructions about masks or hand washing or what is going to open or not open. Let's say we're planning already how to open the economy. Should we give people a plan, or should we just tell them when we're ready to open it? The reality is the more people would know about the plan, the better it would be. So the point I want you to think about is that COVID-19 is sadly a big experiment in learned helplessness. This feeling of not knowing when bad things are happening, and we need to try and add some ability to predict and know to the people around us, the people we can help with that. We can also do things on a personal level. So what would you like? You would want to find something that is under your control that you can see improvement in. For example, if you try to do push-ups and every day you try to increase the push-ups by 1, that will be something that will give you a sense of control, and you can see progress, because one of the important underlying issues is lack of control and lack of prediction. Okay, so the second point was that COVID-19 is to a large degree an exercise, a sad exercise in learned helplessness, and we can do as much as we can to reduce it for other people, but also for ourselves. Okay, moving to the next slide. Okay, the next topic I want to touch on is trust. And there's lots to say. Trust, it deserves a long time. But I want to remind us all about how important trust is here. If I am a government or organization and I give people instructions that are not going to be in their own benefit, nevertheless, I want people to follow that. People have to trust that I have their best interest in mind. And I think that if you look at countries like Russia, if you look at countries like Brazil, if you look at countries like the US, even if you look at the countries like Israel, there's not much trust between government and citizens. And what's happening is that the level of trust is not very high, and therefore people don't find it very appealing to obey the instructions. And COVID-19 or any epidemic is showing how dependent we are on each other, right? Imagine in a regular world, we have 15% of the people don't pay their taxes. That's not good. We have 15% less taxes, but that's what we have. Imagine that we ask people to quarantine themselves for 3 weeks, but 15% of the people don't listen and they go between houses all the time. The quarantine is kind of useless. These 15% are not just 15% less, they completely destroy it for everybody else. So the point with COVID-19 is that it's kind of an example of showing how fragile we are and how connected we are and how important trust is. When also going back to employee satisfaction, imagine I have a company and people are worried. People are worried for good reasons. They're worried about themselves, they're worried about their financial situation, their spouses, their kids, all kinds of things, grandparents. But for me, worrying is not a very productive aspect. Worrying means that people are not able to focus on what I want them to do. And I want to get people to say, we're fine. How much would people trust me, right? You can see how trust, if you trust people, you don't need to worry. You don't maybe look for a job. The moment you don't trust people, lots of things get destroyed. By the way, in all kinds of studies, they show that trust is one of the main contributors to GDP. Because when you trust people in general, life is easy. You don't need complex legal statements. You could do all kinds of things in society. Maybe I'll say one other thing about trust is my favorite trust experiment. So in this experiment, imagine I'm a waiter and I come to a table with 4 people and I ask the first person, what would you want? What do you want? And let's say they say they want the fish. And I say, the fish is not so good today. Trust me. Take the chicken. It's cheaper and better. Cheaper and better, right? Cheaper, worse for me, better for you. And then we measure how much the second, third, and fourth person take my advice and how much the whole table accept my recommendation for wine. That's condition 1. Condition 2, I come to them and it's the same thing. I ask the first person, what would you like? And the person says, I want the fish. And I say, the fish is not so good, they take the steak. It's only 3 times more expensive, but it's amazing. How much are the other people going to take my advice and how much would the whole table take my recommendation for wine? The answer is not so much. What's the difference between the first person, the first waiter and the second waiter? The difference is the first waiter said, I'm willing to sacrifice something for your benefit. I'm willing to sacrifice something for your benefit. The second waiter, we don't know. They said, take the steak. Maybe it's a wonderful idea. Maybe that steak, you'll dream about it until the end you die. Maybe it's the day you die. Maybe it's a wonderful, amazing steak, that like a best decision of your life. But we would never know. We would never know if they did it because they made more money or it was better for us. Whereas the first waiter, clearly, they had our interest in mind. Cheaper and better. Worse for them, better for us. And what this suggests is that in our effort to build trust, we have to take the opportunities when we can give people advice that is against our interest and make it more salient. For example, if I was a financial advisor, I would talk to people about their mortgage. And if they wanted to pay a little bit of their mortgage off, I would say that's great. If it calms you down, go ahead and do it. I, as the financial advisor, want them to have more money with me. But if there's an opportunity to show, no, I care about your well-being. If you prefer to have to pay off some of your mortgage, go for it. I want to show you an example of something where I care more for you than I care about myself. Again, COVID-19, a really good period to try and think about what are the opportunities that we want to show people that we care about. What are the opportunities to sacrifice something from our own for the benefit of our family, for the benefit of the people who work for us, and so on. Okay, let's go back to the slides. Okay, I'll skip the story on Lemonade, but I'll just say that Lemonade is an insurance company that I helped create, that was to a large degree was built on the notion that standard insurance companies have trust very, very broken. And if we could eliminate conflicts of interest and rebuild trust, we could run a much better insurance company. And so far, early days, but so far it's looking good. Okay, next slide. Okay, so let me summarize my part, and I'll turn back to Juan. The things that have always been kind of a pillar of psychological behavior, the causes of motivation, the things that cause us to connect to things, to people and organization, the creators of trust, the creator of anxiety, stress, and learned helplessness. These have always been the same, and they're always building blocks for our behavior, for good and for bad. The thing about periods of this sort and this magnitude is that everything just becomes even more so. So you could say, how much should we pay attention to stress? Always. Now, even more. How much should we pay attention to learn helplessness? Always. Now, even more. How much should we pay attention to trust? Always. Now, even more, and so on. So I think this is going to be, my first book came out in 2008, just when the financial crisis came out, and I didn't plan on it, of course, but it was a good timing because people had a really good reason to start doubting the standard economic model. The COVID crisis is taking every element of our psychology and amplifying it to a large degree, which means that if we want to do any interventions that make sense, whether it's instructions to people, whether it's figuring out how to spend money to revitalize the economy, whether it's getting people to get back to work, all of those things have to take psychology into account. Every one of those things is so much more intense and salient and present and effective that we have to look at those factors. And I think the key to who would be successful and who would not will be those who pay attention to the underlying psychology of these complex times and those who are not. And that's it for me. Juan, back to you.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you, Kelly. Some very powerful points that you have both made with regards to the current transition, the hybrid environment that we're seeing with working from home, but organizations asking themselves how they're going to return to the office. And before I move into telling you a little bit about the tools that we have developed to help organizations precisely with that, I do want to go back and tell you a little bit about an overarching theme that I think emerged between what Kelly said and Dan mentioned, and that's the importance of really understanding your employees and the importance of trust. And this is tied to resilience and organizational resilience and the ability of organizations to adapt to threats. And the key to organizational resilience is something that Kelly touched on and that Dan touched on, and it's how do I foster trust that your organization will be able to quickly adapt to the challenges posed by the new hybrid environment, trust that your organization will identify opportunities brought on by working from home, as Kelly mentioned, the silver linings of working from home, but at the same time, trust that my organization is going to understand the risks associated with returning to work and adjust and maintain operations. So that trust will come out, will help organizations to come out of the crisis stronger than before. And so we take all of those insights, those behavioral insights, that expertise that we have at BE Works, and we have taken them to craft and design two specific tools to help organizations understand their own employees better. And so we have a return to works diagnostics tool that leverages some of the stuff that Kelly was talking about, eliciting preferences in a better way based on what we know from behavioral science, with forced choice, with perspective taking, with ranking, to really understand what are the real needs, what are the priorities for employees. This tool also asks questions about trust in your organization. So what I was just talking about with organizational resiliency. And it also draws on recent research on public healthcare professionals during the COVID-19 pandemic and the things that worry them. Because they're the most at risk while returning to work. So they're worried about their organizations and their leaders understanding them. Do the leaders of my organization recognize the most pressing concerns that we will face as we return to the office? But they're also worried about protection. Is my employer adequately prepared to protect employees from infection? And they're also concerned about training and support. So all of these things are part of this return to work diagnostics tool that we have crafted, and that will give your organization a better understanding of what are the real risks and what are the real needs of those employees, so that you can inform strategies that are based on science, on behavioral science, for a smoother return to work. The work from home diagnostics tool, which is the other side of this coin, is really interesting too. And again, it touches on a lot of the things that both of you mentioned. Trust is very important. One of the analyses that we have done with a sample of employees working from home, with that data, we found that trust was one of the strongest predictors of job performance. But interestingly, it's also one of the strongest predictors of job satisfaction. So it's something to take into account when understanding and designing protocols and measures for your employees working from home. The other thing that I want to mention about this working from home diagnostics tool is that it is based on a predictive model where we take 5 key dimensions: trust, which I just mentioned, creativity, social connection, collaboration, and psychological safety. And within each of these dimensions, we have subcategories that we look at in depth. So for example, cognitive flexibility as part of creativity, or bursty communication as part of collaboration, detachment from work as part of psychological safety. And we can pinpoint which of these subcategories within these dimensions is really pulling employees to perform better and which ones are predicting job satisfaction within an organization, so that you can take those that pull performance and satisfaction and design strategies to enhance the performance and satisfaction of the lowest performing employees within that organization. So to wrap it up, I just want to touch back on the importance and the power of behavioral science to help organizations with this process. It draws on behavioral science, on insights and knowledge of human behavior, and it applies the scientific method. And that's what we have done in crafting these diagnostic tools. So to wrap it up, a couple minutes before, so in conclusion, behavioral science provides many insights that will aid you in navigating this new hybrid environment, this environment that combines working from home and returning to work. And it all begins with assessing perceptions of risk, understanding what your employees really need, and informing strategies so that you can cope with those in a better way. So thank you very much. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Kelly. We hope to keep the conversation going with all of you through our channels, through email, and we will be sending you a recording with the presentation, so you can get more details on upcoming events. Thank you very much.